Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 MTP SCS Update webinar. Today we'll be giving you a quick process update and talk to you about our initial project screening. Today joining me is Clint Holtzen, who's our project manager for the MTP, and Bruce Griesenbach, who's data modeling manager here at SACOG. Before we get started, just a few logistics. All of you are on mute, so if you do have a question, please be sure to type that into the chat box. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar and addressing most of them after the presentations, but feel free to type them in at any time. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SACOG website. At the conclusion of the webinar, you should also receive an email with the recording. Again, feel free to send your questions at any time. Before we jump into the presentations, we do want to issue two quick polls for you. The first is just asking you which sector you represent, so we'll start that now. If you could just take a brief moment to select which sector you represent, we'll give you a minute or two to enter your information. Okay, great. Thank you for that. It looks like we're seeing a lot of city and county agency representatives and other public entities, but we appreciate you joining us today. So again, we'll issue one more quick poll before we get started. So what we're looking for here is just if you participated in the last cycle of the MTP SCS update, yes or no. Give you a second to fill out your information here as well. Great, so it looks like we have a good mix of participants who have and have not participated in the MTP SCS process update. So you might be aware that we are in the middle of doing our public workshops right now and going through our project screening. So I do want to introduce our two staff who will be presenting today, Clint and Bruce. Again, please type your questions at any time. We're happy to field those and answer them at the conclusion of the presentations. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SACOG website. So we'll be sending an email update with that information to you. So without further ado, we'll kick it over to Clint.
All right, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Real quickly, what we want to get through today is I'll give you kind of the objectives of our webinar. I'll walk through a process update so that everyone has a good understanding, hopefully, of exactly where we're at in the process and what we're hoping to get out of all of you in the coming months. And then I'll turn it over to Bruce, and he's going to go over the initial project screening we did on all of the projects nominated for this round of our MTP update. And then, like Adrian said, enter your questions as we go, but we will do a formal Q&A at the very end and answer all the questions that come in throughout the webinar. So the objectives is we really want to make sure you're all informed on exactly where we're at, what the upcoming activities and milestones are for this plan update. We're about to send out the project list for this discussion scenario to all of our contacts, those of you that responded to the initial call for projects that we held back in March. We've got through our initial screening and review of those projects. We want to make sure you're familiarized with exactly what you're looking at when we send out that list so that you're prepared to have that dialogue with us over the coming months. And then for those of you that need to be prepared to brief your leadership back at your home agencies, we want to make sure that you are articulate and understand exactly what is going on. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this more detailed slide, but we did want to provide a more detailed schedule so that those of you that you can download this presentation afterwards have a useful reference to kind of see month by month exactly where we're at, where we're heading. So this 2020 plan update, we're dealing with several new issues that we haven't dealt with in prior plans. We've got a much higher greenhouse gas target that we're striving to hit with this plan, and that's really important for a number of reasons. Important to many of you for the fact that that is one of the ways that we can attract a lot of state funding to this region if we're able to hit that greenhouse gas target. We're also looking at the effects for the first time of some of those new mobility options out there, things like Lyft and Uber and autonomous and connected vehicles. We want to spend a little bit more time with this plan really investigating those issues. And then we're also looking at, for the first time in a while, at how system pricing as a management strategy we might be able to employ in this region. We do not have pricing. We don't have things like tolling or in our region like a lot of other regions are. So we're looking at those types of options with this plan. And that's kind of where we're at right now with this discussion draft scenario. It really is a foundation to start asking those questions and doing some of that testing. So those of you that have been through this before, the steps we're going through are very similar to what we've done in previous plan updates. We develop a series of scenarios. We've in the past done 3 scenarios, but we've learned a lot over the last several cycles from doing all of that scenario planning. So something that's different in this plan is we're just doing a single discussion draft scenario. It's based on a lot of the learnings that we've done, that we've acquired from our previous plan updates, but we just have this one discussion draft scenario this time around. And then we will use this to have a dialogue with you all, have a dialogue with our board to discuss some of the performance outcomes, the implications with the plan, the financial assumptions in the plan, and then what the policy goals are of our plan, and then use all of that information this fall to take what we learned from this discussion draft and have a conversation and have our board take an action on a preferred scenario framework. And I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what exactly that scenario framework is. But this discussion draft is a first step in getting to that. And that action we're hoping to get from our board in December. And then, so once we get to that December action, we will really start honing in on what the actual plan looks like, what the final set of land uses are, what the final set of transportation projects to support those land uses will be. And that is developing that preferred scenario, the project list, the land use forecast, the revenue forecast and budget. That becomes the basis for the draft plan, and we're hoping to have that wrapped up by April of next year. So this is a long schedule, but really it's all here to kind of, the take-home point you should take from today with this schedule is this discussion draft scenario is our first cut. There are still a couple of milestones before we get to a final project list and land use allocation by April. So we have plenty of time for dialogue and discussion with all of you before that's there. So when you are looking through the project list and you see projects that are included or not included, that is not the final set. That's our first cut. We want to talk with you and have some productive discussions around those projects. So this is a little bit more detailed schedule on exactly what we're working on with you, which is the project list and the call for projects. So in March, we had that initial call for updates to all of our member agencies, to all of you lead agencies for projects. That wrapped up in March 23rd, and since that time, we've been going through, doing our review. We have had some back and forth with agencies to clarify that we understood exactly what the projects were, and we've conducted our initial performance screening. We're now entering the fall period, the September to November period, where we're going to be taking the performance indicators from this discussion draft and having a conversation with our board. We're going to be asking you to review the projects that we've included in the discussion draft scenario, have a discussion about local priorities, have a discussion about the performance of different projects, and begin our financial constraint analysis of the nominated projects. And then, as I mentioned previously, December, we'll have the board act on a preferred scenario framework, which is really just that set of goals, strategies, of investment priorities. It is not taking an action on a project list. It's not taking an action on a land use allocation. It really is taking an action on the direction that the board wants us to go. How do they want the plan to perform? What are the investment priorities that they have for the plan? Are we including pricing in the plan? Are we including an emphasis on fix it first and maintenance like we did in the last plan? It's really to just kind of form the framework, the bookends for what we're trying to achieve with this plan. And then in between that January and April is when we're really trying to hone in on the final set of project lists, the final financial forecast, and the final land use allocation. And then following that April milestone, we have about a year to build the rest of our plan, to write the plan, to do the EIR, to do all of the technical analysis so that we can adopt the plan in April of 2020. And that is our full schedule. So I mentioned financial constraints. So just to give you all an idea of where we're at with the project nominations that came in March. By federal law, the MTP has to be financially constrained. So it's not like a lot of other plans. It's not like a general plan. We're required to do a forecast of revenues that will be available for the plan, and we have to build our investments around or constrained by those revenues. So we'll project the likely sources of local revenues, state, federal sources, and those of you that have done this before have a good sense of how we do that. And then the board sets a policy on how much of the budget do they want to dedicate to expanding our road system, to maintaining our road system, to our transit system, to bicycle and pedestrian investments. And they give us parameters over what of those major expenditure categories they want to emphasize. So one of the challenges we always face is that the sum of local requests that come in the project nominations, they always exceed the amount of revenue that we're forecasting. And this is part of the reason we do a discussion scenario. It's to have information to you and to the board so that we can make a performance-based decision on where we're prioritizing our expenditures. So our project nominations came in at well over $10 billion in costs. The current plan has about $6.2 billion in road and highway capacity projects. So we've got about $4 billion gap between where we're at in the current plan and what we have nominated for this next plan. And one of the challenges we're facing is weaning that list down. And we're trying to tailor it roughly to land somewhere very close to the existing plan in terms of for this initial discussion draft, in terms of the expenditures on highway and roadway capacity projects. So just to get a better sense of what is the discussion draft scenario, in March we held a webinar that really talked more about the land use component and what the discussion scenario was and the purpose of it. I want to go over that again for those of you that weren't in that webinar, or it's been some months now, so easily forgotten since you're not living it every day. The land use component is it's our allocation of employment and of housing or households across the region. And that really is important because land use is very much a driving force in how people choose to travel. And so in June, we took an initial land use allocation to our board. We vetted that in April and May with local agencies, and there were some concerns about that land use scenario, and we've since been having discussions with those that had those concerns and are working through those. But following the land use scenario, we took the project list and we're trying to marry up the transportation investments to that land use scenario. And I mentioned earlier, we're really trying to key the level of investment to something similar that we had in the last plan. So that means that a lot of nominated projects had to be trimmed back out of the discussion scenario to line up with that investment level. The purpose of all of this is not a draft plan. This is not a final scenario. If a project is included or not included, that does not mean that it is a final decision. This is really just a way to get some performance indicators, to do some testing, some modeling, some analysis, to better understand the effects and the trade-offs inherent in the types of investments we're making, so that we can actually start seeing, are we hitting our where are we in terms of being able to hit a 19% greenhouse gas target? And for reference, that 19%, our previous plan had to hit a 16% greenhouse gas target. And that 3% difference is very, very significant. 3% doesn't always seem like a lot, but when it comes to reducing vehicle miles traveled and when it comes to reducing emissions, a 3% more strict target or greater target is a very difficult thing to hit. So one of the questions is, do we have a chance at finding a scenario that can improve on the performance of the last plan and give us a shot at hitting that greenhouse gas reduction target? And then how do our land use, our transportation, our revenue, our pricing, all of those things that we can turn the dials on, how can they affect that scenario? And so that's kind of where we're at. That's the purpose of this discussion scenario. I want to turn it over to Bruce so that he can walk you through how we went about narrowing down from that really expansive set of nominated projects down to something that we can start to do some testing on and some analysis on, and want to have a conversation with all of you over the coming months.
Okay, switching to me, this is Bruce, the data analysis manager here at SACOG. And part of the reason that I'm doing this part of the presentation is the team that does the transportation modeling and analysis here is under my management. We maintain a regional travel demand model known as SACSIM. For some of the people I'm on this webinar, you or your staff are probably familiar with that and may have even used that model for some of your evaluation of local development projects. But for our purposes of SACOG's work on the MTP and for the Clean Air Act, in other words, the air quality conformity work, and for our SB 375 work, the greenhouse gas reduction target primarily, we use SACSIM as a way of forecasting the travel demand and the GHG and greenhouse gas emissions for SB 375. It's vehicle emissions, passenger vehicle emissions on roadways. We use the SACSIM travel demand model to do those forecasts. And with the projects that were nominated through the call and all the subsequent work that SACOG staff has done with local entities to better understand the projects, especially projects that had changed significantly since our last interaction with you over the long-range plan, or new projects, there was a fair amount of communication between members of SACOG staff and your agency's staff to sort of better understand those projects. And we have done an initial forecast that paired go to the next slide here. This is where we're trying to do the project phasing analysis. The first step in trying to do the winnowing down of the highway capacity project list, again, to fit within the budget level that we had in our 2016 plan, the current adopted plan, was to look at the fit between the proposed transportation projects and the draft growth allocation that was Clint referred to and was shared with local agency staff through the spring and was finalized as a public document for in June with our board. We fit that together with the full list of projects that were nominated and literally do an initial forecast. And from that forecast, what we're looking at is where do demand changes and capacity changes on the highway system kind of match up in terms of that draft growth allocation and then the proposed projects. For the current adopted plan, the 2016 plan, we used 3 screening questions, and they really were, and we've sort of used that same process to do this screening for this one. The questions are fairly simple, and it's when you look out at the horizon year of our plan, which is 2040 for this plan update, we look at whether the roadway where a project is proposed is congested either in the base year or in the future year. And if there's no indication that the roadway is congested, that's one flag that we identify for a potential project that could potentially be delayed in the plan cycle. In other words, delayed potentially outside of the horizon year of the plan. And a second question we ask is, where a project is proposed, does the roadway show a increase in vehicle demand that's less than, or an increase in capacity that's less than the increase in demand forecasted for that roadway? And if the capacity increase is significantly higher than the demand increase, that becomes a second flag for a project that could potentially be rephased later in the, potentially outside the horizon year of the plan. And then finally, we use a roadway utilization concept that's more of kind of an economist view of a roadway, where if a roadway is significantly underutilized, it's looked at in terms of the travel conditions for an individual traveler. They may be great. You can fly along the road with essentially no congestion. But in terms of a return on investment or an economic look at that roadway, a roadway that's underutilized, it means you've spent a lot of money on capacity to build a roadway, and you're spending a lot of money to maintain that roadway, but you're not fully utilizing it. And so we use a relatively simple concept of roadway utilization as a third screening flag. We went through that process with the 2016 MTP SCS, which is the current adopted plan, and we're sort of repeating that with this plan. And the key differences is we're looking at a 2040 horizon year. We have an updated regional forecast and growth allocation, and we have all the projects that were nominated through the call for projects. That's a lot that I've thrown at you, and I'm going to pause just to allow people to kind of absorb that, and I'm looking at incoming questions. So, and I'm going to try and deal with a couple of questions before we get to the next slide. Why were the projects solicited before the scenario was complete? The project list just becomes a shopping list, not a list of projects that support the scenario. So the projects were solicited before the scenario was complete because we actually try and build the scenario from the nominated projects. For a lot of the projects, they're common to the current adopted plan, and we're just getting a re-up of that same projects. But there's new project ideas that came in through the nominations, and there's projects that changed. They were present in the current plan, and they are proposed to be included in the next plan update, but the scope and description of the project may have changed significantly. And so through the project call that Clint described that ended in March, that's a chance for everybody to update information on the projects, and we will ultimately build our draft preferred scenario, and that's the scenario that would really form the update of the plan by April of 2019. We build that from the call for projects, so that's kind of why the order is in that way, and I hope that's responsive to that question. And then everything on the list provided is a capacity expansion project. Where and when do we do transit, walking, bicycle projects, and so on. I'm going to refer back to the a couple slides before, and I apologize for backtracking. What is the discussion scenario? So number one, correct that the project list that we sent out included highway capacity projects only at this point. In general, when we do these calls for projects, we do get a lot more highway capacity and projects nominated, and relative to transit and alternative modes projects. And the detail that we get on the highway capacity projects is usually much greater than on the transit and the alternative modes projects. So we have to go through that, and generally speaking, the number of projects so far exceeds what the budget level we're trying to work within, that we have to do a focused look on the phasing related to highway capacity projects. And the project list that we did send back to you just includes those highway capacity projects. In terms of the discussion scenario, we are setting the kind of the levels of transit service and alternative modes, the bike and ped projects primarily, to roughly the levels of the current adopted plan. On the transit side, there will be some adjustments, and the adjustments come in through changes to short-range transit plans that we get from the transit operators. And then there are some differences in the nominated projects that we got through the call, and we will be adjusting that. But the transit scenario will be an ambitious transit scenario that looks somewhat like the transit scenario that's in the adopted plan based on what we're seeing so far. And the same, I'd say, for the alternative modes. So there will be a separate process on that. And we're working with our transit coordinating committee and the transit operators individually to try and get the projects that are represented in the plan straight through that process. Hopefully that gives some good answers to the questions that came in so far. I'm going to get back to where my slides are. So phasing in the discussion scenario, and this is particular to the highway capacity projects that we sent out to the registrants to the webinar and some other staff that have participated in the project call. Again, we started with the draft land use allocations for 2040. We paired that with an all nominated projects list, and we identified roadway segments that meet those three phasing questions, one of those three phasing flags. And from that analysis, we've identified projects that we wanted to definitely include in the discussion scenario. And then that's all keyed in the, there's one column in the project list that indicates the status in that discussion scenario. Hopefully that's clear. We call it a discussion scenario because we do intend there to be a fair amount of discussion around it. Some of that discussion Clint described as some of the policy discussions that we have to have with our board at a much higher level. But some of those discussions will involve individual local entities. And we assume that the discussion scenario that we've sent out in terms of the highway capacity projects is going to be the major point for most of our member agencies. And we're actually looking forward to those discussions happening. So to the extent that anybody who's participating in this webinar or has gotten the project list through other means from a member agency is interested in having that dialogue on how we came to the discussion scenarios that's listed there, we're happy to organize an opportunity to do that. We will bring additional information related to your member agencies and your jurisdiction for the forecasts that we've prepared so far, and some of the rationale that led to the screening discussion that we've talked about, the screening questions that we've outlined. And we're perfectly happy to hear your responses to that and questions about that and concerns about that and differences in priority that you see based on that discussion scenario. We went through that process for the getting to the final version of the current adopted plan, and we assume that that process is going to take place for this plan as well. The only thing we will ask you to do, and Clint's going to get into more of the process and calendar moving forward when I turn this back to him. But the only thing that we do hope is when we have those conversations about the highway capacity projects on that discussion scenario. That we also, in terms of our member agencies, that we have some inclusion of the planning department and some of the land use, some staff who's familiar with the land use part of the plan as well. The discussions on this work a lot better if everybody is represented in that. And so that's our request to you. And that was essentially what I had to say so far. Again, last plan, there was a fairly intensive discussion with a lot of our member agencies. We're assuming that's going to happen again. We're looking forward to that. And Clint will talk a little bit about how the time frame for how we're going to do that and how to communicate that.
So, I see some questions rolling in, and we'll start Q&A, but just to put a fine point on exactly what the next steps in this are. So this webinar was really to give you an intro where we're at in the plan, where your points of input as local agency staff and others are going to be over the coming months, and to give you the heads up that this discussion draft is coming. So in the next day or two, at the very latest by the end of this week, you all will be receiving a fuller version of the project list. So what we sent out as an example for this webinar was the highway, the capacity projects. We have gone through a review of all of the projects. So that includes the maintenance projects, the bike ped projects, the transit projects that were submitted. We applied this initial screening criteria because the highway and road capacity are kind of the foundation of our travel model. And like Bruce said, we're using the transit system from the previous plan. But we're going to send out that project list to all of you to kind of review our notes, to continue the clarification, to see whether we've included your projects or not in this discussion scenario. And we're going to ask you over the next month to do your initial review of those projects and to reach out to us if you want to have a meeting, you want to have SACOG staff come out to your jurisdiction and talk through your project specifically. We're going to ask you to do that over the next month. Review our questions and our comments, attempt to respond to them, and then let us know if you want us to come out. This is not a hard deadline this is your last chance to give us your changes to projects. This is just, we want your initial reactions, and we want to know if you want to come talk to us. We fully expect that this discussion draft and honing in on a final scenario is a very iterative process that we're going to go through with you between now and December when we adopt the preferred scenario framework, and then again, or in more detail between December and April as we try to hone in on a final list of projects. So that's what we're expecting out of all of you. And as Bruce said, it's always very helpful if you can have more disciplines in the room. So this list goes out to the transportation planners, to DOTs, to Public Works. But if you can bring your economic development folks, if you can bring your land use planners along, if you're having us come out, it just enriches the discussion, and it's very helpful. So with that, that's what's coming, and then we can start to address some of these questions. But feel free to keep typing in your questions now, and we will get to them as they come in.
Thanks, Clint. So as a reminder to everyone, especially for those 35% or so at the beginning who did not participate in the last cycle, if you visit sacog.org and click the Regional Plans tab, which is on the home page, you'll be able to learn more about present and past MTP cycles. So that would be a good information source for you. All of the contact information for all SACOG staff, but especially the MTP SCS team, is on that Regional Plans page and throughout the sacog.org website. So let's take a brief moment to review and answer some of your questions. So continue to type those in since we have a few minutes remaining on the webinar. Okay, thank you for entering some of your questions. So we'll go through them one by one. So the first is, how do current and expected changes in the retail landscape affect analysis of transportation system performance in the future? That is trip generation at the household level and at the retail site level.
So it's a great question, and part of that is what we intend to look at as the potential kind of disruptive change. We've talked to our board about all the various things going on, not only with new transportation modes, but also with things like retail, travel, behavior, if you will. I guess it's a complicated question, and there's no real great, resounding, satisfying answer to it, but there's two kind of dimensions that could be affected by that issue. One of them is, again, how much travel is generated for shopping, and are people actually substituting shopping trips to brick and mortar outlets or institutions with online kind of things. We will get a good snapshot of how current retail travel may have changed relative to what it was in the past. We've just recently completed a detailed household travel survey. We will be getting the data from that survey, which took place over the summer. It's 4,000 households roughly, and all persons within the household for travel over the course of a 7-day period for most of the households. We'll be looking to that survey to help us answer the question, like, where are we now relative to where we were prior? The speculative changes about what might happen moving into the future, though, and how those trends might continue, we may get into some of that with this risk analysis of the plan, but given the number of uncertainties there, we can't totally create a scenario with a presumption about what may or may not happen in retail. So it's something we're going to try and make some progress on in this plan, but we will not have a resounding and satisfying answer that's going to satisfy everybody, I'll guarantee you. The second place where the question really might affect the plan is in the degree to which sales tax revenue feeds into funding transportation projects, and I'm going to let Clint talk a little bit about how that's going to be handled in the revenue assumptions for the plan.
So the specific question is, where does the allocation of funds to different modes get considered in the whole MTP SCS process? So we will be bringing information to our board starting this month, September, where we'll be mailing out our staff report this Thursday on the kind of the requested budget and the cost of the capacity projects. But over the coming months, we'll be looking at the transit side, at the active transportation side, at the program side, at the transportation demand management side, at kind of, and as we do our financial constraint analysis and our revenue forecast, at how much the board wants to prioritize different spending in those budget categories. Not all funding is flexible when it comes to transportation. Some of it comes along with development, and it's only for certain types of projects. Certain state and federal funds are only for certain types of projects. And so in our current plan, we've got a $35 billion budget, and a chunk of that is flexible, and we can use it for different types of projects, for different modes. The majority of it is really dedicated to specific types of projects. So that December action on a preferred scenario framework is really where we're asking our board to weigh in on when we get to the flexible funding that we can spend on anything from maintenance to transit to capacity expansion, which of those do they really want to emphasize? And so that December framework is really kind of where our board will start taking an action on what they want this budget to shape up to be.
Great, thank you, Clint. So we have another question that I think Bruce can address about why this is called the transportation scenario when it only includes capacity projects. So should it be called something else like a capacity expansion scenario?
Yeah, and sorry we're throwing a lot at you very fast. The discussion scenario will include a significant increase in transit service and funding of transit service. By the horizon year in our current plan, the if you looked at it on a per capita basis, the service levels on transit roughly nearly double. And we're assuming, for purposes of the discussion scenario, we're using that level of transit service as a kind of a guidepost for what the discussion scenario includes. So the discussion scenario in terms of transit looks a lot like the current adopted plan. As Clint mentioned, through the course of this fall and by December, the board could take a different decision on how much transit service should be included in when we actually re-up the plan. The discussion scenario just starts the process of having that conversation. We have to start somewhere. So I hope that gives a little bit of better background on that. And then there's a similar question that came in right at the end there. Can you read the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, and it looks like they're referencing the spreadsheet that you sent, Bruce. In the discussion scenario column in the spreadsheet, some note yes and others note post 2040, but there are several that are blank. And so the question is, what does that blank field indicate?
Yeah. So yeah, good question, and thank you, Rick. So post 2040, that note in that column came in if the sponsor themselves identified the project as something they would not be ready to deliver until after 2040. That's based on the information that we got. Yes, obviously, it indicates a project that we felt like it is included in the discussion scenario. The blanks are projects that, for reasons related to primarily to those screening criteria, we've left them off the discussion scenario. And those projects would be the subject of continued discussion with local entities and sponsor entities.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So there was a question here about asking if we as SACOG staff could send that project list to planning staff in addition to public works.
Yes, absolutely. If you receive the land use allocation from Jennifer Hargrove back in April and May, we will make sure that you are included when we send out this project list. That's a great suggestion, and we will make sure we do it.
Great. So let's give everyone just another minute to enter their questions before we close out the webinar. Okay, great. Thanks for continuing to enter your questions for us. Again, we will be sending you this webinar recording, and we will include the slide deck as well, the PowerPoint presentation itself, if you would like to go through that. So I have another question about how does the capacity projects we talked about today relate to that 19% DMT reduction set by ARB?
Right, and to be clear, the 19% is actually on GHG. Subtle but important point, and to keep in mind. So I wish I could say that there's a simple and direct answer to that, but there really isn't. It's much more complicated. But there are a couple of relationships. And one thing I do want to emphasize, we've talked a lot about GHG reductions, and at least a lot of members of our board are really focused and have a huge level of priority put on that specific performance metric. But if you went around our board, there's many, many things that they're interested in. Clint touched on some of them. The level to which we actually make progress on state of good repair as a region and maintenance of roadways, managing congestion in our region, and getting more people in active modes and improving health. There's a lot of other performance metrics that might be related to GHG reduction, but they are not GHG reduction. And so we need to look at a full slate of things as we update the plan. So it's not totally just about GHG reduction. So wanted to get that out. But in general, the roadway capacity projects, to the extent that if you looked at our overall investment in the plans as a kind of a cross section, and if you look at our current plan, there's a there's a great table, and I can't tell you what the table is in Chapter 4, the investment summary, that talks about the investments by different categories of investment. And we've alluded to that here, that there's a category of roadway capacity, there's a category of system management and operations, there's a category of transit capital, there's a category of transit operations. And the degree to which we go above the amount on one of those, we have to make it up in another category. It's a budget-constrained exercise. So part of the reason we're being very careful about which roadway capacity investments we target for inclusion into the plan overall is to make sure that we have room in the budget to do other things as well. And part of it is to make sure that the maintenance is a value for a lot of our board members, and the ability to focus on state of good repair and improving roadway maintenance is somewhat related to the amount that we're spending on capacity in a couple different ways. One of them is some of the funds could be used for either one. There's limits on that, but some of the funds can be used for either type of project, and we're sensitive to that. The other thing is the degree to which you build more roadways, you have to maintain them over time. And so overbuilding on the capacity side, if you have alternatives, leads to higher maintenance costs over time. So those are some of the relationships, but the primary one in terms of achieving that specific target that was the question, the subject of the question, the GHG reduction target, if we spend more than we currently are on building new roadways, we have less money to spend on other things that can help us to achieve, more transit ridership, more people biking and walking, and that kind of thing.
Great, thanks, Bruce. I have a few more questions coming in. Was analysis made of compliance with fix-it-first maintenance criteria in the proposed project list?
So I'll try to answer that one. If I don't hit it on the head, we can follow up with you after the webinar. But we haven't done an analysis yet on maintenance and rehab for the project list. We did receive nominations for maintenance projects, especially with SB1. There was a large increase in requests for including maintenance projects in the list. But even with that request, we don't have, I call them line items. Each project is a line item in the project list. We don't have all of the spending for the next 20 years spelled out by project in the project list. But we treat the maintenance a little bit different. We call it a big lump sum of maintenance. And so what we try to do is, can we capture enough funding to maintain all of our roadways going forward? And some of that will be defined by individual projects nominated by local agencies, but those tend to be a little bit more near term. Not many agencies forecast their maintenance schedule by project out 20 years. And then so after we've gone through the line item projects, we try to look more at, what's the size of our network, what's the age of our network, what's the current condition of our network, and do a forecast of what it's going to need. That is still kind of a to be determined or a coming analysis that we'll be performing over the next several months as we start working through a more detailed set of financial projections. There is a major ballot initiative coming up that's related to the next question, that if Proposition 6 passes, will this impact the funding assumptions and require that the discussion scenario be redone for reduced funds? That is a major decision that will very much affect the amount of money we have for maintaining our system. Largely, that's what SB1 is for. We won't have to redo our discussion scenario for this. If that doesn't pass. It will have implications. There will be projects that don't get done, and we will have to take that into consideration as we develop the preferred scenario, absolutely. We won't redo our entire discussion scenario. I think what we've got included in there can withstand whether that proposition passes or not, but that is a major question that gets to how much funding largely we have for those fix-it-first, those maintenance projects, our highway projects, active transportation projects. It will have a ripple effect on the plan. Exactly what that is still to shake out because we don't know exactly, where our board is going to prioritize our flexible funds. Those are the questions we're trying to answer over the coming months. But yes, we will do an analysis on maintenance of our system, and we will need to kind of revisit our budget priorities if Proposition 6 passes. And for those, I assume everybody on here knows, but for those of you that don't know, Proposition 6 is the proposition to repeal the fuel tax that was passed as part of SB 1.
Great, thank you, Clint. So let's give everyone another minute or so to type in your final questions, and then we'll wrap up today's webinar. You'll get a recording immediately following this in your email, and then we will post it on the SACOG website by the end of the week. So let's give everyone just another minute to enter your final questions. Okay, we're not seeing any other questions come in, so we'll close the webinar for today. Again, feel free to visit the SACOG website. All of the contact information for the staff that presented today, Bruce and Clint, are available there, as well as other MTP staff. We'll be sending you an email in the next few days, so feel free to continue to email us your questions. Thank you for joining us today, and we will be following up with you shortly.